April 9th, 1945. Dawn breaks over the Bavarian mountains. The air in the Flossenbürg concentration camp is freezing. In the concrete courtyard, guards push 7 men forward. They do not offer blindfolds. They command the prisoners to strip. The men stand naked on the cold pavement, humiliated, shivering. Among them stands Hans Oster, 57 years old, a Major General of the Wehrmacht. The executioner does not load a rifle. He does not sharpen a guillotine. He points to the ceiling. Heavy iron meat hooks hang from the beam. Thin cords wait on the table. The death will not be instant. It will be slow strangulation. Why did a high-ranking general end up on the gallows? He swore an oath to the leader, but his hatred for the regime was stronger than his duty. At first glance, a traitor to the state, but in reality, the most dangerous enemy of the system. Oster spent 12 years in the shadows. He didn't just disagree. He stole documents. He leaked invasion plans. He organized plots to assassinate Adolf Hitler. But this was only the end of the road. Files show a different beginning. Oster was not born a rebel. He started as a supporter. He wore the uniform with pride. He saluted the rise of the new order. The transformation from loyal officer to resistance leader was slow and painful. In the frame, the camp walls obscure the sunrise. The executioner adjusts the noose. The cords are short. The suffocation begins. Oster fights for air, but gravity wins. Thus ended the conspiracy. August 9th, 1887, Dresden. A child took his first breath in the strict silence of a pastor's house, Hans Paul Oster. His father was Alsatian, a man of the cloth who demanded more than just faith. He preached duty. He preached honor. He preached total submission to God. In this household, morality was not a debate. Right and wrong were not suggestions. They were absolute coordinates. Young Hans absorbed this code like oxygen. He stood straight. He listened. He obeyed. This rigid foundation would one day force him to commit the ultimate crime in the eyes of the state: treason. But history would give it a different name: heroism. No one looking at the pastor's son could have predicted the future. He would become a ghost in the machine, a man dangerous not to the Allies, but to the Führer himself. The path began in uniform. 1907. Oster entered the Imperial German Army. He chose artillery. 7 years later, the world caught fire. The Western Front, mud, shelling, the smell of cordite. Oster didn't just survive the trenches, he mastered the chaos. By 1916, his talent for cold logic pulled him out of the mud. He was promoted to the general staff. This was not just a new rank, this was the inner circle, the strategic brain of the war machine. Only the elite entered these rooms. Oster proved himself brilliant, methodical, utterly devoted to the flag. He collected medals for his service while millions died in the fields. Then came the crash. The war ended in defeat. The Treaty of Versailles crushed the German military. The army was slashed from millions to a mere 100,000 men. The officer corps was decimated to 4,000. Most were sent home, but not Oster. He remained. That was his value. By 1929, he wore the rank of major. He had a wife, Gertrude, 3 children, a stable home. At first glance, a perfect German career. But in reality, it was a house of cards. 1932, the year everything collapsed. One mistake destroyed decades of service. The details were buried in redacted files, but the consequences were public. Oster went to the Rhineland during a carnival, a demilitarized zone, strictly off-limits for officers in uniform. He didn't go alone. He was seen with a woman, a married woman, likely the wife of a superior officer. The code of honor was breached. The investigation was swift. The verdict was merciless. December 31st, 1932. While the world celebrated the new year, Hans Oster signed his resignation. He was 45 years old. The uniform was gone. The pension was gone. The reputation he built since 1907 vanished overnight. He was a civilian again, a pariah. The camera records, a man walking out of the barracks for the last time, stripping the insignia from his shoulders. He was adrift, angry, desperate for a way back, and he was about to make a choice that would place him in the center of the storm. 1933. Adolf Hitler seized power. The Republic died. New agencies sprouted like weeds. Oster needed work. He founded in a shadow organization run by Hermann Göring, officially a research department under the Prussian police, in practice a wiretapping center. He listened to the secrets of others. He managed the flow of information, but this was only the beginning. October 1933. Oster transferred to the Abwehr, military intelligence. He wasn't an officer anymore. He was a civilian employee, a bureaucrat in the counterintelligence sector. Why did he join them? It seemed he had every reason to hate the system, but the promise of restoration was stronger than pride. Here is the uncomfortable truth. Like millions of Germans, Hans Oster initially welcomed the new regime. Think about his position. He was a castaway, a soldier without an army. The Nazis made bold promises. They swore to tear up the Treaty of Versailles. They promised to make the military iron and steel again. Order, authority, strength. To a disgraced man, this didn't look like tyranny. It looked like salvation. He saw a chance to wash away the shame. He saw a path to restore the Germany he served. He didn't know yet that he had signed a deal with the devil. He was wrong. June 30th, 1934. That date became a dividing line in German history. Before this night, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris supported the rise of the Führer. Countless military officers did the same. They saw Nazism as a path back to national greatness. But the night of the long knives shattered that illusion. In a single night, the SS unleashed coordinated violence across the country. 85 people died. Perhaps hundreds more vanished. Hitler ordered the killings to eliminate Ernst Röhm and the leadership of the SA. He viewed them as rivals to his absolute power. But the purge did not stop with the stormtroopers. It bled into the ranks of the innocent. 2 deaths shook Hans Oster to his core. General Kurt von Schleicher was the second-to-last chancellor of the Weimar Republic. An assassin shot him in his own home. His wife threw herself in front of him. She died on the floor beside him. General Ferdinand von Bredow faced the same fate. He was the former head of the Abwehr. He was the man who once led the very organization Oster now served. These were not street thugs. These were not political radicals. These were German generals, men of honor. They were murdered without trial, without charges, without a judge. Schleicher had been Bredow's superior. Bredow had been Oster's boss. At first glance, a political cleanup, but in reality, a declaration of war against the rule of law. Why did the army do nothing? It seemed they had the power to stop it, but the generals chose silence. They accepted the murders. They convinced themselves it was necessary for national security. Hans Oster watched this betrayal. Something inside him broke. He realized the truth. He was not serving a government. He was serving a regime of gangsters. 1935. Oster was allowed to rejoin the army, but he was banned from the general staff. Admiral Canaris, now heading the Abwehr, brought Oster into his inner circle. He appointed him deputy head of counterintelligence. On paper, Oster ran the Central Division. He managed personnel. He balanced the finances. But his actual role was far more dangerous. He began to turn Germany's military intelligence service into the headquarters of the anti-Nazi resistance. But the transformation from skeptic to active conspirator required one more push. 1938 brought 2 shocks. First came the Blomberg-Fritsch affair. The Gestapo fabricated scandals. They targeted War Minister Werner von Blomberg. They targeted Army Commander Werner von Fritsch. Heinrich Himmler orchestrated the entire scheme. The goal was simple: install compliant leaders, tighten the Nazi grip on the military. Oster watched from the shadows. Honor, truth, and tradition were sacrificed for political manipulation. Then came November 9th, Kristallnacht. Events accelerated. Nazi thugs rampaged through German cities. Synagogues burned. Jewish businesses were destroyed. The footage shows. Broken glass covers the cobblestones. Smoke rises above the rooftops. Oster saw the violence for what it was: state-sponsored barbarism. The pastor's son made his final choice. He would not just observe. He would use his position in the Abwehr to destroy the regime from within. The Abwehr was the perfect cover for conspiracy. It could issue false papers. It could provide restricted materials. It could disguise treasonous activities as legitimate intelligence work. Oster used the system against its creators. He linked different resistance cells without raising suspicion. He gathered the secret information that the conspirators needed. He became the spider at the center of the web. He connected generals, diplomats, clergymen, and civil servants. They shared one conviction: Hitler had to be stopped. In 1938, the circle expanded. Oster met General Ludwig Beck. The chief of the General Staff openly opposed Hitler's plan to invade Czechoslovakia. The lines were drawn. There was no turning back. August 1938. General Ludwig Beck was out. Hitler forced the resignation, and the shockwave hit the Wehrmacht like a physical blow. The officer corps froze, but Beck's successor, Franz Halder, did not stay silent. In private, he called the dictator the incarnation of evil. He gathered his closest allies and joined forces with Hans Oster. Together, they sketched a plan on paper. It was the birth of the Oster conspiracy. The strategy was elegant in its simplicity, a trap set for a dictator. Step 1. Hitler orders the invasion of Czechoslovakia. Step 2. Britain and France declare war. Step 3. The conspirators strike. They would not just arrest him, they would drag him before a court. A panel of psychiatrists stood ready to declare him criminally insane. A new government waited in the wings. It was a perfect coup, but the plan hinged on one variable. Britain, Oster used the Abwehr network to smuggle emissaries into London. Their message was desperate: stand firm, reject the threats. If Britain held the line, war became inevitable, and the German army had its justification to move. They needed the catastrophe to prevent the disaster. Why did the plan collapse? It wasn't the Gestapo. It was politics. September 28, 1938. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to Munich. He shook Hitler's hand. He carved up Czechoslovakia on a map. There was no war. There was no coup. Hitler won without firing a single shot. The conspiracy crumbled in bitter disappointment. But Oster did not break. September 1939. The World War began. Hitler immediately turned his eyes west. Oster reactivated the network. He and Admiral Canaris cornered General Halder. They argued that an offensive against France was military suicide, but the dictator sensed the hesitation. He spoke darkly of destroying the spirit of Zossen, a direct threat to the defeatism at army headquarters. Halder panicked. The footage would show a man consumed by fear. He burned the files. He destroyed the evidence. The conspiracy paralyzed instantly. Then Oster crossed the final line. He did something his fellow conspirators considered madness. It was treason, plain and simple. Early 1940. Hitler prepared the tanks for the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. Oster reached out to his friend, Colonel Bert Sass, the Dutch military attaché in Berlin. It wasn't a one-time leak. At first glance, a casual dinner between friends, but in reality, a transfer of top-secret intelligence over 20 separate occasions. Every time Hitler set a date, Oster whispered it to Sass. Every time Hitler postponed, Oster provided the update. Sass wired the data to his government immediately, but the Dutch leaders refused to listen. May 10, 1940. The Wehrmacht rolled across the border. Total surprise. The warnings had been accurate but ignored. Oster watched the news in silence. He knew the cost. His leaks could kill 40,000 German soldiers. He was betraying his uniform, his oath, his nation. But there was a colder calculation. If Germany won quickly, the war would drag on for years. The death toll would reach millions. His conscience made the choice. Save millions, sacrifice thousands. The pastor's son chose the greater good over the flag. It nearly destroyed him. This was the price of resistance, not glory, but the impossible moral math that turned decent men into what their government called traitors. 3 years. That was how long Hans Oster spent building a shadow army inside the Nazi regime. It was a dangerous game of impossible moral calculations. Decent men were forced to become what their government called traitors, but Oster did not stop. By 1942, he had secured a critical asset, General Friedrich Olbricht. Olbricht was not just an officer, he was the head of the General Army Office. He controlled the communications and logistics for reserve units across the entire Reich. At the same time, Oster extended his reach to the front lines. He established a direct line to General Henning von Treschow within Army Group Center on the Eastern Front. The trap was being set, but then the mission changed. Why did a high-ranking intelligence officer risk everything for strangers? Because in 1941, the systematic extermination of European Jews began. Oster could not simply watch. The story takes a sharp turn here. Hans Oster, the deputy head of military intelligence, weaponized the Abwehr against the state. He teamed up with his colleague Hans von Dohnanyi and the theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Together, they launched Operation U-7. The plan was audacious. They took 14 Jews. They dressed them as Abwehr agents. They forged passports stamped with the official eagle of the Reich. They created fake intelligence missions. Then, they smuggled these 14 people into Switzerland right under the noses of the SS. They burned political capital. They called in favors. They gambled their lives to save people the regime wanted dead. But the Gestapo was always watching. In April 1943, the secret police struck. They arrested Dohnanyi and Bonhoeffer. The official charge was currency violations and financial fraud. At first glance, a bureaucratic investigation, but in reality, a hunt for the resistance corps. Interrogations followed. The methods were brutal. Under torture, the prisoners revealed information that pointed directly to Oster. The pressure mounted. Admiral Canaris, facing an ultimatum from Hitler himself, had no choice. He fired Oster and stripped him of his post. The network was decapitated. Events accelerated. July 20th, 1944. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg entered the Wolf's Lair. He slid a briefcase bomb under the heavy oak conference table. The explosion shattered the room. 4 men died instantly. But Hitler survived. Operation Valkyrie had failed. The reaction was swift and merciless. A wave of arrests swept through Germany. On July 21st, the very next day, the Gestapo cars arrived for Hans Oster. The interrogation rooms were cold. The questions were relentless. Under unimaginable physical and psychological pressure, Oster made a fatal slip. He named Admiral Canaris as the spiritual founder of the resistance movement. That phrase sealed the admiral's fate. The Gestapo dragged Canaris into custody. For months, they investigated. They tortured. They demanded names. They found evidence of a general conspiracy, but they lacked the smoking gun linking Canaris directly to the July 20th bomb. Both men were kept alive. This was not mercy. It was calculation. Hitler demanded more names. Heinrich Himmler had a different plan. He believed he could use Canaris as a bargaining chip to negotiate with the British when the war turned. So they waited. Oster sat in a cell in Leipzig. Canaris was shuttled between various detention sites, enduring isolation and the constant threat of execution. They knew death was coming. Then came April 4th, 1945, 1 month before the final surrender. The war was irretrievably lost. The Third Reich was collapsing into rubble. The map showed the end. Soviet forces crushed the defenses in the east. American and British divisions swept in from the west. The circle was closing. There was nowhere left to run. "20 miles south of Berlin. That was the distance between the collapsing front lines and the secrets of the Third Reich. Soviet forces closed the net from the east. American and British armies swept through Western Germany. The regime was crumbling. But in the abandoned offices of the Abwehr headquarters, a German officer forced open a steel safe. Inside, he found several heavy binders. He opened one. It wasn't a tactical manual. It was a diary. The handwriting belonged to Admiral Wilhelm Canaris. Page after page was filled with ink. Names, exact dates, detailed accounts of resistance meetings stretching back to the 1930s. Why did a master spy keep such meticulous records of his own treason? It seemed suicidal. But perhaps Canaris believed these notes would serve as insurance, or maybe he intended them as evidence for history books in a post-Nazi world. Perhaps he simply enjoyed the thrill of documenting his deception, but the reason did not matter. These binders were not insurance. They were a death warrant. A courier rushed the files through the ruins to the Führer bunker. April 5th. Adolf Hitler sat at his desk and read the diaries. Witnesses described the scene. The bunker walls shook with his screams. He slammed his fist on the table. He shouted about scoundrels. He yelled that these officers had stabbed Germany in the back. The order was immediate. No trial, no delay. Execute them all. Events accelerated. On April 7th, the machinery of death moved Hans Oster from his cell in Leipzig. He was thrown into a transport vehicle headed for Bavaria. The destination was Flossenbürg concentration camp near the Czech border. He was not alone. Admiral Canaris, Captain Ludwig Gera, General Karl Sack, and Pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer were loaded into the same transport. They saw the stone quarries of the camp. They knew what was coming. April 8th, an SS drumhead court-martial convened. The judges were Otto Thorbeck and Walter Huppenkothen from the Reich Security Main Office. Camp Commandant Max Kogel sat beside them. At first glance, a legal proceeding, but in reality, a theatrical murder. The verdict was written before the prisoners entered the room. One by one, the accused were dragged forward. One by one, they were convicted of high treason. One by one, they were sentenced to death by hanging. Hans Oster stood before his executioners. He spoke a phrase that defined the tragedy of his life. "I did it for show." Those were his words on the record. The stenographers wrote it down. Some interpreted this as a desperate lie to protect himself. Others heard bitter sarcasm. He was mocking their sham trial with a sham confession, but the arguments no longer mattered. The gavel fell. The outcome was absolute. Death. The sun went down on April 8th. Darkness filled the camp's detention building. The condemned men sat on the floor of their cells. They could hear the guards patrolling outside. They knew the schedule. Execution at dawn. Sleep was impossible. Fear and regret mixed with silent prayers. Thoughts raced through exhausted minds. Hans Oster was 57 years old. He had fought Hitler from the shadows for 12 years. Now, he waited to die in a concrete box. American artillery could be heard in the distance. Liberation was only 2 weeks away. The cruelty of the timing was absolute. April 9th, 1945. Dawn. The story becomes almost unbearable here. But history demands the truth. This is how the regime treated its enemies until the very last second. This is the price Hans Oster paid for choosing conscience over compliance. At approximately 6 in the morning, heavy boots stomped down the hallway. Guards stormed the detention building. They shouted commands: get up, strip, completely. The men were forced to remove every article of clothing. The footage exists only in memory. 5 men standing naked on a cold floor. The humiliation was total. 7 men stood shivering. Their clothes lay in a pile on the dirty concrete. The humiliation was absolute. An admiral, a general, a pastor, all stripped naked before their killers. The guards laughed. They pointed fingers, mocking the aging bodies of the Reich's former elite. It was a calculated psychological break. At first glance, a standard prison procedure, but in reality, it was the first stage of torture. The group was shoved through the doors. Outside, the courtyard waited. The morning air bit into their skin. They huddled together, trying to preserve a shred of dignity in the freezing temperature. The scene in the courtyard was industrial. There was no wooden platform, no trap door. The camera records, a cold horizontal beam stretching across the killing zone. Attached to the metal were heavy iron hooks, butcher's hooks, the kind used for suspending slaughtered cattle in a meat plant. From each hook hung a loop, not a thick rope, but a thin cord. Why use such a specific tool? It seemed like improvisation, but it was pure sadism. Hitler had demanded suffering. A standard military hanging breaks the neck. The drop causes instant unconsciousness, quick, clean. But there was no drop here. The plan was different. The victims would be hauled up slowly, just high enough so their toes barely grazed the soil. The thin cord was chosen for a specific reason. It would not snap the vertebrae. Instead, it compressed the windpipe. It squeezed the carotid arteries, slowly, painfully. Death would not come in seconds. It would take 10 minutes, 20, maybe 30. Some legends claim the SS used piano wire. This is false. Piano wire cuts through flesh like a razor. It causes rapid blood loss. Hitler wanted prolonged agony, not a quick bleed out. Witnesses confirm the cords were twisted hemp, strong enough to hold a man, thin enough to cut off air by millimeters. The cords were tied into slip knots, one loop for the neck, one loop for the hook. Hans Oster was the first. The executioner, Wilhelm Rutger, signaled his two assistants. They grabbed the general. The noose tightened around his neck. 3 men lifted his dead weight. The cord strained. They looped the upper end over the iron meat hook. Then they let go. Gravity took over. Oster's body sagged. His toes scraped the dirt, searching for support. But there was none. The cord bit into the throat cartilage. The airway collapsed. The biological reaction was immediate. The chest heaved, fighting for oxygen that could not pass. Lungs burned. The heart hammered against the ribs. Vision narrowed to a tunnel, then grayed out at the edges. But total darkness did not come. Consciousness remained. The legs kicked reflexively. The toes clawed at the earth, trying to lift the body weight to relieve the pressure on the windpipe. Muscles failed. Exhaustion set in. Every survival instinct fired at once. None helped. Oster did not die alone. 6 others faced the same machinery. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Karl Zach, Ludwig Gehre, Theodor Strunk, Friedrich von Rabenau. 7 naked bodies twisted on the hooks, 7 men dying in synchronized rhythm. The courtyard was not empty. SS officers stood by the wall. They smoked. They watched. The camp doctor checked his watch, waiting for the thrashing to stop. The footage would show men in uniform observing a slow murder with bored expressions. It was not quick. Witnesses differ on the exact duration, 10 minutes, 15. Some say the agony lasted half an hour. But one fact is indisputable. The victims remained conscious for the majority of the time. Hans Oster spent his final moments unable to speak, unable to breathe, his brain slowly starving. Finally, the body went limp. The heart gave out. The doctor stepped forward. He placed a stethoscope on the chest. Silence. He nodded. The same ritual was repeated 6 more times. The bodies hung there for a while, a final display of power. Then came the cleanup. Guards cut them down. They dragged the corpses across the yard to the camp crematorium. The furnaces roared. By morning, Hans Oster was nothing but ash in a mass grave. No marker, no name. He ceased to exist physically. But the tragedy holds a final cruel twist. April 23rd. The date is significant. Exactly 2 weeks after the bodies burned, engines were heard outside the gates. The 91st Infantry Division of the U.S. Army rolled into Flossenbürg. The camp was liberated. Just 14 days. If the execution order had been delayed by a fortnight, Oster would have walked out alive. If the Gestapo had found his diaries 3 days later, the paperwork would not have been processed in time. Events accelerated. Hitler committed suicide 3 weeks later. Germany surrendered 1 month later. Oster missed it all. He died naked and choking. He died believing his conspiracy was a failure. He thought his life's work had achieved nothing. He could not know that history would rewrite his reputation. He could not know he would be called a hero of the resistance. He passed into the dark in total despair. Thus ended the life of the spy. Traitor or savior? The definition depends entirely on who writes the history books. Hans Oster betrayed his government. There is no ambiguity here. He stole classified files. He passed military secrets to foreign powers. He plotted to assassinate the head of state with high-grade explosives. Under any statute in any nation, this was high treason. The penalty was death. But Oster was loyal to something far more permanent than a regime. He served the Germany that existed before the madness. He chose moral law over the orders of a dictator. Why did he do it? It wasn't for glory. He wasn't a radical firebrand. At first glance, a rigid Prussian officer, but in reality, the system's most dangerous enemy. Oster was a man of tradition. He believed in hierarchy, discipline, and the chain of command. Every instinct in his military upbringing screamed at him to obey. His religion taught him that authority came from God. But that same faith drew a line in the sand. Evil was absolute. There could be no compromise. Events accelerated. November 1938. Glass shattered on the streets of Berlin. Synagogues burned. Innocent men were dragged from their homes. Oster saw the reports on his desk. He heard the gunshots. He realized that the generals were being murdered without trial. The machinery of the state had turned into a slaughterhouse. His conscience gave a simple command: resist. He didn't just disagree in silence, he built a weapon. The network Oster constructed was a spiderweb of defiance within the Wehrmacht. Operation U-7 was not just paperwork, it was a lifeline. 7 agents risked execution to pull 14 Jews from the jaws of the Holocaust. They forged passports, they smuggled currency, they moved human beings across borders under the noses of the SS. Oster went further. He sat at his teletype machine and tapped out warnings to the Netherlands. Invasion imminent. He gave dates, he gave times. The Dutch ignored him. They couldn't believe a German officer would leak such plans. But Oster tried. He handed explosives to conspirators. He facilitated attempts to blow up the tyrant. This was not a brief rebellion. It was a marathon of terror. 12 years, from 1933 to 1945. Every single day, Oster walked into his office knowing it could be his last. The phone rang. Was it a contact or the Gestapo? A car slowed down outside. Was it a deliverer or a death squad? He lived with a target painted on his back. But courage has a limit against a totalitarian state. In April 1945, the end came. The regime was collapsing, but its executioners were still working. They dragged Oster to the gallows at Flossenbürg concentration camp. He was stripped. He was humiliated. The trapdoor opened. Thus ended the life of a patriot. But the injustice did not end with the war. Here is the question that remains. Where were the others? Thousands of officers saw the same atrocities. They smelled the smoke of the camps, but they polished their boots, saluted, and looked away. They told themselves that one man changes nothing. Oster proved them wrong. He proved that one man is a fortress. But the post-war world delivered a final bitter insult. The year was 1956. A West German court convened to judge the men who sentenced Oster. The defendants were Otto Thorbecke and Walter Huppenkoden, the SS prosecutors who had sent him to his death. The gavel came down. The verdict was shocking. The court ruled that the Nazi government had the legal right to execute traitors. Oster's execution was declared lawful. The men who murdered him walked out of the courtroom into the sunlight. Free men. It took decades for the stain to be removed. 51 years passed. Only in 1996 did the German judicial system overturn the Nazi verdicts. The records were corrected. Hans Oster was finally reclassified, not a criminal, but a victim of tyranny. Today, his name is carved into stone on street signs. Children learn in schools that bear his name. The hangman is forgotten, the traitor is a hero. 15 minutes. That is how long the struggle on the rope lasted. Historians still open the files and argue over the result. Was the sacrifice worth the blood? Skeptics shake their heads. They point to the warnings sent to the Netherlands. The messages were ignored. The intelligence was discarded. From a tactical view, the resistance changed nothing. But others see it differently. They argue that every jammed gear in the Nazi war machine was a victory. Every leaked document was a blow to the regime. Why did he choose this path? It seemed like suicide. Logic dictated silence, but Hans Oster ignored the calculation. Faced with absolute evil, he made a decision. He chose to act. Even when the cause looked hopeless, even when he knew no one was listening, the end was not just an execution, it was a spectacle of cruelty. Flossenbürg concentration camp. The guards stripped him, complete nakedness, a final attempt to steal his dignity. The executioner did not use a standard drop. He used a thin cord attached to a meat hook. The archives record the details, the feet kicking in the air, the slow tightening of the wire, the suffocation dragged on. 15 minutes of agony. At first glance, a judicial punishment, but in reality, a personal vendetta. Hitler demanded this specific brutality. He wanted the conspirators to feel small. He wanted them to scream. The dictator's goal was total erasure. The bodies were burned. The ashes were scattered in the wind. No grave, no marker, no place for pilgrims to kneel. He wanted their names dissolved into nothingness. But he failed. The regime collapsed. The archives opened. We know the name Hans Oster. We document his courage. We analyze the sacrifice. The lesson remains sharp. Even under the boot of the darkest tyranny, a single individual can stand up. But this was only one file in the cabinet. What other erased stories are waiting in the dark? Do parallels to Oster's choice exist in the modern world? Write the answer in the comments. Subscribe to the channel. The next investigation will challenge the standard narrative. It will expose the terrible price of loyalty. Because the truth is cold. Heroes do not always receive medals. Sometimes they die alone on a concrete floor. They die believing they failed. But their names outlive the executioners.